Last time we looked at rational expectations. And found out that the world does indeed work on expectations, sometimes at even big levels. So what did it take for an expectation to be rational? What did it take for an expectation to be rational? Based on all available information. All right, so we've kind of looked at everything. What was that in contrast to? Jeff, give me a number between 5 and 12. 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Chad, what was the other thing with rational? Were you here last time? You weren't here. Oh, boy. Okay. So let me put you to the test a different way then. So what do you expect the weather to be this weekend? What's that? Snow. Why?
What the forecast said.
Okay, so you listen. So you watched the forecast.
Yeah.
Apparently, or heard it, right? So, is that a rational expectation for snow that there'll be snow this weekend? Is that a rational expectation? Yeah. Right? Now, somebody else who hasn't watched the Weather Channel might say, oh, it'll probably be like today. You know, what is it today? It's likely that you might, if you don't have any other available information, that you might think tomorrow's weather will be like today's weather. And you wouldn't be too far off usually thinking that way, as long as we're not thinking too far out. As we know, in Kansas, we can have 40-degree swings pretty quickly, but for the most part, it's not going to be 80 tomorrow, right? And so whatever today's weather is might be a pretty good expectation of tomorrow's weather, even though it might be different. But a better expectation would be rational, where we went to the experts, as expert as they can be. They're almost as bad as economists, right, with their weather predictions, but they are predicting snow this weekend by studying radar and Doppler and all of their stuff. So we don't have to be experts to make that expectation. We can get information from experts and be pretty rational about our expectation on the weather. All right, so how does that work with the economy? So let me see, what did I leave you off with last time? Okay, so we ran through all the steps. Did we get them all done? And the economy moves directly to point B. Okay, so we didn't talk. All right. So I teed you up for potentially the case of being wrong. All right, so where's my markers here? So if we were, better run dual exhaust here. Okay. If we were to map real GDP over time, what would that graph look like? Straight line? Fluctuate up and down, right? If we're looking at actual data for real GDP, we'd expect it to fluctuate. Now, we have talked about a straight line too. When or how did we have a straight line? What did we do to get a straight line? The average, right. So we looked at the trend. So we kind of had these thoughts of, at any given point in time, real GDP could be high or low. It kind of goes up and down. Those are the ups and downs of the economy for reasons that we're studying in class. But if we average them, we can think about the long-term trend of GDP. It has an upward trend, and maybe it's been growing by 3% on average, right? So maybe we have a 3% trend. which is an average over time. But what the economy's really done is gone up and down. So the problem that I teed up for you last time was if we had rational expectations, it seemed to be that we didn't have any movement in output. That's because we were correct. But do we expect to be correct? On average, yes, but at any given point in time, there's probabilities that we're going to be wrong. And so it's actually more likely that we're going to be wrong rather than being right on the money every time. So we can probably pretty reasonably predict that our average trend might be like this, but at any given point in time, things could be trending or could be above or below our average. And so this trend line you can start to think of as being, let me put this in blue. The trend line is our potential, our long run potential is the blue line, whereas the orange line is the actual real GDP at any given point in time. Okay, so let's draw our graph again. This time, doing an example. So go ahead and draw a long run equilibrium, which I recommend you can regurgitate at any given point in time for this class. Oops, that's got a little too much tilt to it for my preference here, so that should be perfectly vertical. We've got the potential level of real GDP, some initial starting point for the price level, just for fun. We tend to put 100 there just to keep the numbers easy. Okay, so our question we're going to tackle today, or right now, is what happens if our expected aggregate demand curve does not equal our actual aggregate demand. What happens if that's the case? What's that? Well, you're gonna be operating on your expectation on resources. So we're gonna first kind of try to tackle the mechanics of the model to see if we get some insight into it. So suppose we underestimate. Suppose the public underestimates the change in aggregate demand. So let's kind of look through the steps that I gave you last time. What was the first step in this process? The first step was that we were in long-run equilibrium, maybe, if I remember right. Didn't I put long-run equilibrium first? Okay, what's number 2, Trey? What do you got?
Public forms a rational expectation.
Okay, you got it. You were saying it right. Yes, we do got to be able to read our handwriting. Might want to edit that.
How about future
All right, so the public forms an expectation about the future aggregate demand. Now, the thing I teed you up with last time is that we had $100 million of government spending going on. But in reality, there's all kinds of things. Like maybe there's a decrease in taxes proposed. Maybe maybe there's a war going on in Europe or in some other land, right? So there's all kinds of economic events going on at the same time. And we might go to our economist and our newspaper to get some estimates of what we think the economy is going to do in the future. And so go ahead and draw an aggregate demand curve somewhere to the right. By the way, it could be to the left. So I'm just running under the assumption that aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. We could be expecting it to shift to the left. So just kind of note that we're going to form that expectation, step number 2 on your list. And the key thing to this expectations theory is that people are going to react to, or they're going to act on their expectations. And so what was the key next thing that happens? What happened next? How so? They request the higher wage as kind of the labor story, and as Jeff pointed out, that might seem a little far-fetched, and it probably is to some degree, but we're kind of thinking about the macro economy, and we're thinking about the pressures that might be going on in the resource market. So if we kind of step back and now try to think about the big picture about the downstairs market, the resource market, they're always negotiating prices and contracts, and there's Wall Street, and there's Main Street, and there's employers, and there's employees, and there's all kinds of things going on in the resource market. And from this expectation and from our economic model, we start to form an expectation about what inflation is going to be, and we act accordingly. All right, so how does that manifest itself in our model? Good. Is that step number 3 on your list? Just so everybody's kind of tracking with what we did last time. Too bad I don't follow my own set of notes, so I can't tell you. I need you guys to help me here. Zach? 3/4. 3/4. Okay. So on 3/4, steps 3/4, we can start to learn where the inflation rate's going to go by the intersection. Is this 3? By the intersection of long-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, the expected aggregate demand. So the public starts to get an expectation about inflation that is expected. So make sure you put the superscript E up here. And I'm going to change the example. What did I do last time? 3% or 5%? 3. So let's do 5 this time. So let's say this goes up to 105. Chapter 4 and maybe 5, 4 and 5 taught us inflation is the difference between these two. New number minus the old number divided by the old number. 105 minus 100 divided by 100 gives us 5% inflation is our expectation. And therefore, the action that takes place is on the short-run aggregate supply curve today. We're not waiting until actual inflation goes up, but we already start behaving today. That's the key point. And so, based on that expectation, the actual short-run aggregate supply curve starts to move, perhaps at the same time that the actual aggregate demand would start to move. This analysis gets kind of chunky. So here we were at $10. We know that we're going to go here in the long run, or we expect to go there, I should say. We don't know anything, but we expect through a rational expectation that there's going to be 5% inflation. And so I ask my boss for a 50-cent raise, a 5% bump in pay, in anticipation as I'm negotiating out those contracts, I'm going to start acting on my expectation, not necessarily waiting for Obama's policy or Janet Yellen's policy to kick in. Right? And so the actual aggregate demand I expect to move here, I'm already acting on that information. That's subtle looking, but very powerful result from an economics perspective, because we're shortening that distance between the short run and the long run. All of a sudden is closing in on us. We're not telling that same Keynesian story that we did before. Okay? So, that's where we're at so far. Questions up to this point? We still haven't addressed my problem here. Suppose the public underestimates the change in aggregate demand. If that's the case, where should you put the new aggregate demand curve? To the right of this one or to the left of this one? Which one would best reflect an underestimate of the effect? Right or left? Let's see, show of hands. We'll do a little democratic vote here. How many people say to the right? Raise your hand. How many people say to the left? Raise your hand. Ooh, we're close, but it looks like the rights have it just slightly. And the right is right this time. Right? The right is right. All right, so now we gotta make sure we're gelling with this thing. So first of all, this movement was caused by underlying variables like what we expect $100 million worth of weapons being purchased is going to do to the economy. So that's what we expect. If that actual effect comes out to the red line, if AD2 is actually out here, then the public, there's the estimate, right? There's what actually happened. We underestimated the magnitude, the size of the effect. If we're thinking about the size of the shift, I guess I'll start from this long run. If the price level was to hold constant in kind of a Keynesian fashion of sticky prices, the magnitude of the shift would have been this horizontal distance. But now we've underestimated that, so the actual shift was greater than what we estimated it to be. Okay, a lot of hands went up on that. Give me a question if I can try to clarify. Does that make sense now that I walked through it? Those of you who had the opposite way? Okay. All right, so there's our underestimate. And so what's the result? Where does the economy go? Short run aggregate supply and the actual AD, right? So way back in your notes from a couple times ago, this would have been chapter 10, I said that the current state of the economy is always given by the intersection of the actual aggregate demand curve and the actual short run aggregate supply curve. That's where the current state of the economy is. And here is the result of our whoopsie. From our whoopsie, we ended up having output that's greater than what was expected, Y2. And we have inflation that is higher than expected. Maybe it's 107. What type of gap we got? Inflationary gap, right? So when the current state of the economy is greater than its potential, we have that recession or that inflationary gap. So upward pressure on inflation. We called that because now what's going to be the natural hand, back to Adam Smith here, what would be the natural adjustment that would take place if the economy was left alone? With kind of a hands-off thing here. Tell me where we go from here now. Matt?
Up both ways.
Up both ways. So what do you want? Tell me what you're doing here. Actually, come on up for a sec. This will be easier than doing air ball here. We'll get you an extra credit point for your wonderful participation with the red pen. Tell me where we're going.
We're gonna move up here, right? And then up here. So, like,
Okay.
since it goes up and up this way, we would just do the same, right?
Okay. All right, go grab your seat. Let me get you your extra credit point. Does everybody agree with Matt? Sammy, you're shaking no. Why?
Just because you're not at home.
Okay, come on up for a sec. Let me see if I can. It's just hard for me to kind of see what you're thinking without. We'll give you the green one here. So we got debate in the classroom. This is great. Matt versus Sammy. Let's see where this. Let me get you your extra credit point even before you put it on there. All right, Sammy. All right, go for it. What's going on?
Since it moves here,
Okay.
you want it, your short-term average supply will move up and move you back along.
All right, so Sammy says we're going here in the long run with a hands-off policy. Thank you. Does anybody got a different result other than Matt or Sammy? Yeah, that's a. I thought my incentives might be a little perverse there, aren't they? So, all right, now, well, so where is the economy headed? 82 and what? Long run aggregate supply. Now, let me come back to Matt's for a second. So Matt's is not correct in terms of where this thing would play out with a hands-off policy. But how could we make Matt's answer correct? Aggregate demand moved again, which I think I could tell that's the story you were telling. So I know you had the right idea, but your gut was telling you that you wanted to shift this again, and not without something else being in the problem. So if I layered on another question, suppose starting from this point, the government decreases taxes. So there's a homework problem to make math right. I give you a picture, and it looks like this. And then I say, so that's your starting point. Remember, it always is relative to what your starting point was. So if this is our starting point, and I say, suppose the government decreases taxes, then that would shift this, and then we'd end up heading up this direction again. Okay? All right, so Sammy, nice work. We got our short-run aggregate supply curve heading towards this point in the long run. So let's see. I want to kind of work through the example here. Because now we're talking about a couple different effects, a short-run effect and a long-run effect. Okay, so let's start off this with short-run effect. So, step number one, I'll kind of abbreviate here. We form our expectation. Two, we adjust, resource prices adjust based on that expectation. Resource prices adjust based on the expected aggregate demand. Now here's where we get kind of clunky. And I'm going to put a little special note. This is where it gets kind of clunky, because if we follow my step-by-step analysis there, if we act before this thing shifts, doesn't the economy actually move this direction? Right? So that's where I'm saying we're clunky, because what's really happening is that the aggregate demand curve from the policy as well as the short-run aggregate supply curve are both moving together at the same time. They could be at various speeds, but for the most part, we're moving that direction towards that viewpoint. And then we're going to find out if we're right or wrong. So under this step 2, we got resource prices adjusting, which I'm going to put here is the shift left, downward arrow, the shift left of the SAS. At the same time, we have aggregate demand increasing. So I'm going to put, we also have, if this is part A, part B, we also have output prices adjusting. So there's a increase in aggregate demand. Causing output price increases. From our model, we might be kind of just roughly within reason moving around the range of moving from A to B. So we're moving from points A, so note, moving from A to B. Moving from A to B. But then we hit a little bit of a roadblock here. And that's our new step 3 here. But if the aggregate demand that was expected does not equal the AD2, we have 2 possible cases. Two cases. One is the problem we're doing here, the underestimate. The underestimate, which means ADE didn't shift as far as it's less than the AD2. And that will cause us to move to this, let's call it point C here. Economy moves to point C. With the actual level of real GDP greater than its potential, and an actual price level that's greater than what we expected. All right, questions on getting ourselves to point C? Case number 2, we're not showing on this graph, so we could do an overestimate. where our expected aggregate demand curve is actually greater than what actually happened. Make a little note to yourself that this case number 2 is not shown on the graph. Not shown on the graph, the current graph that we're doing. But I think this is the best spot to visualize that. If we have an overestimate, then economy ends up with output less than, let's just call it actual now, with actual output less than its potential since it's not shown, and a price level that is actually higher or less than the price level that was expected.
So, if they underestimate, is Y actually going to be less than the potential, or just less than Y2?
You talking about case 2 with the overestimate, or you said underestimate?
I meant with
You
the
meant over?
overestimate.
Okay.
But at what point would Y actual ever be less than the long run
Okay, so let's
aggregate supply?
let's look. So let me golf club it. So case number 2 that's not being shown here, let me show it. Aggregate demand moves to here. Look at the new intersection of the new short run aggregate supply curve and the new aggregate demand curve is right here. Drops south,
Okay.
outputs less than potential. Okay? So basically we screwed up, and with rational expectations we have an equal probability of screwing up on each one. We have a little bell curve here. We have an equal likelihood of overestimating or underestimating. We're not sure, right? So we're recognizing that there's variability in the economy, and that's indeed what causes these fluctuations, is uncertainty in the economy. And that turns out to have some powerful implications. But I want to finish up my list here. So anything else on this step so far? Long run. Well, maybe I'll squeeze it in here. This is going to be pretty short. So long run effect. So with invisible hand, the marketplace just naturally correcting itself. With invisible hand, we're always going back to where the actual aggregate demand curve intersects the actual long-run aggregate supply curve, which is this point D. So we're going to head towards point D in the long run. So with invisible hand, economy moves to point D. And of course, that brings us back to potential. So the actual level of output is equal to its potential. The economy is back to potential level of output. However, we don't get back to the old price level. So the implication of this with these adjustments that we made is that we end up at a higher price level than where we were before. So we kind of ratchet up at a new price level, PL3. So we got a PL3, let's call it, a price level that's permanently higher than where we were before at the starting place. Now, think about how that weaves into our story of the long run multiplier and how how this could play out in the macro economy. As long as we underestimate the effects of government policy, they're like, no, the government would never spend that much money. No, the government would never, that'd be ridiculous if they actually ended up spending that much money. As long as we have that mentality, when the government pursues a fiscal stimulus policy, do we get a little bump in activity? Do we get a little bump? If we tend to underestimate the effects of government policy, we do get a little bump. And the politicians kind of see, oh yeah, well see, that policy worked, right? So if we tend to underestimate the policy, we do get a little bump in real GDP, which is good on our checklist of good things. But ultimately, after the correction takes place, that good thing really isn't so good because there's no long-lasting real effects. Kyle?
Is it actually bad on society because of these rates of cost of living?
That's right. That would be the long-run effect, is that you're right. It would be just purely inflationary. So if we go down our mental checklist of the 3 goals, number 1 is increasing real GDP. Number 2, low unemployment. Number 3, low stable inflation. And so what Kyle is pointing out here is that on our checklist of things, did we get this? No. We got it in the short run, but not the long run, which gives the politicians incentive, possibly if there happens to be a vote coming up this fall, that maybe they should do that so that everything looks a little rosy come election time. But our analysis long run says we're not going to get a bump in that. If we don't get a bump in that, do we get any increase in this or any change? No, right? So there's no change, so it's not any better. It's maybe not any worse, could be argued. And then this one, we have a unanimous increase. We have an increase in the short run, which the politicians might have thought, there's this trade-off. We get more people employed. Back to the Phillips curve analysis, we get more people employed, but we have a little bit higher prices, but who cares with a little inflation? Everybody pays a little bit at the register. That sounds fair, right? If we all equally pay a little bit more at the register. But ultimately, with that underestimate, we end up here. Can this start to kind of destabilize the price system? We've seen lots of examples historically of that happening. One of them in the United States, when we got inflation rates up into the 10, 12, 13% range, and interest rates as high as 18 and 20% for a home loan. For a home loan. So you go to buy a house. Anybody know what rates are currently right now? If you're a good credit risk, what you can get a 15-year or 30-year?
We just got 3.9.
3.9. So Jeff just got 3.9%. 18% would have been the norm in 1981, 1979. I can't remember exactly when those interest rates were, but 18, 19, 20% interest because of it coming a little bit out of control. Thinking that we can kind of do something causes these unintended consequences that, if they're not dealt with seriously, can be a major negative draw on the economy. Other economies have much worse stories. We looked at Zimbabwe with a zillion% inflation, Argentina, Germany, the list goes on and on. Mexico, there's other countries around the world that have seen this hyperinflation where it really gets destabilized. Okay. Anything else? Okay, the next thing I want to do is connect this thing back to the Phillips curve, which is what we started with last time. So, we're going to draw 2 graphs side by side with each other. The Phillips curve had what variables on its axes? what were the two variables for the Phillips curve? Inflation and unemployment. Good. So we had inflation and unemployment, which are related but not the same thing as what we just did. And so that's why I want to do the connection. So this is the connection of rational expectations and the Phillips curve. So draw two graphs side by side with each other. There's not really any connection horizontally, but just for your graph, draw them nice and big on your paper. Hog up both sides, you know, your whole width of your paper. Draw some nice big ones because there's going to be a lot of detail in this one. Draw the long-run equilibrium for the goods market. On the graph to the left. We can do our little convention here of starting us off at 100 for the price level. And then over to the right, we're going to have the Phillips curve. So you can put the inflation rate on the vertical axis and the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis. And go ahead and draw the long-run Phillips curve, which, remember, was vertical, thinking after we thought about it, you know what, why would there be a relationship between these two things in the long run? And so we'd expect in the long run that the unemployment rate will be the natural rate of unemployment. Now as we see these standing side by side, nice and tall with each other, hopefully we get the direct connection here between the two, the long run concept. We've got the potential level of real GDP at the long run aggregate supply curve. And that makes sense that that is correlated with full employment. Full employment of labor would be the natural rate of unemployment. All right, so the short run Phillips curve showed a trade-off. A potential trade-off that Phillips observed in looking at long-run, long-range studies of unemployment and inflation. And the nut that we cracked as we went through that process was a connection to inflation expectations. And we said that where these two cross, the publics formed an expectation about inflation. All right. So with this one, let's do an, what did I do? Overestimate? No, I did an underestimate, right? So let's do an overestimate of aggregate demand. An overestimate. I'm going to walk around the room and see what you guys got. Go ahead and draw an aggregate demand somewhere. It doesn't really matter. Just go ahead and draw aggregate demand that you expect to happen is your first step. And if you've overestimated it, draw the new AD2. And if you're uncertain, then raise your hand and I'll come and look at, and I'll tell you if you're right or not. screwed up apparently. All right, so let's see if we can get it reset. Okay, come on, boy. There we go. All right, so